Okay, so we're going to have a look at the history of operating systems. And strangely, the history of operating systems looks very much like a family tree with lots of individuals, those who have also created like new offspring and siblings and everything else. And therefore, we end up with a very strange mixed, and this is a simplified version, bear in mind. So you can imagine if all the variants were put in as in addition to the main versions of operating systems. So we start off, all operating systems really start off one of two major camps, the biggest of which was the very early development of something called Multics, which very quickly developed into Unix. And Unix still exists even to this day, used by large computers as well as small. But the problem with Unix was it was a for-profit operating system. You had to pay for it. You had to be quite rich in some regards. So universities would have access, which they'd use for teaching students. But many, individuals wouldn't be able to afford it. So may not have the equipment to be able to run it neither. Also required, reasonably high end at that particular point in time to run that particular operating system. Now that changed quite quickly over time with one offshoot of Unix, which was intentionally intended for use of academics and students, called Mimics. Now, Minix is not important in regards to what it achieved itself, but the people and the team who developed Minix taught a young gentleman by the name of Linus Torvalds, who then went off and created his own version of Minix, which is known by everyone as Linux. And you may or may not have heard of Linux, but Linux is a very important operating system. Linux itself is what's called the kernel of the operating system. It's the very guts, the very heart of the operating system. Everything which is on top can vary depending on how you want it to look and feel and what particular tasks that particular version of the operating system performs. So we end up with quite a number of what we call variants or distributions. So Linux itself created 5 major, subcategories from Slackware, Debian, Red Hat, Gentoo, and also Arch Linux. But what's more important is these distributions themselves have created sub-distributions, such as, for example, the Chrome OS, which is often used on Chromebooks, is a variant of Gentoo Linux, which of course comes from Linux itself, which itself comes in directly from Unix. So all of these things are related. They all share a very common ancestry going back to Unix. And even what arguably is one of the most common, if not the most common operating systems in the world, not what you may be thinking about, not Windows, but possibly Android, is also a variant from Linux. And Android itself has created some later offspring in the form of Fire OS and so on. So this is the structure of operating systems. It's very chaotic sort of, development upon development, which creates many layers. Now, of course, the one operating system which you might be familiar with is Windows. Now, Windows itself doesn't start, believe it or not, from Microsoft. It's based on previous work in the form of CP/M. So if I build a sort of just a little model here on Windows. So Windows itself wants to start a text-based operating system, not what we see now. So this is Microsoft in development in the early 80s, and they wanted to build a text-based operating system. And they actually had a contract with a big company at the time called IBM to build a operating system which was called PC-DOS. And PC-DOS, to develop quickly, was based on an operating system previously used in business called CP/M, Control Program and Monitor. So PC-DOS very much based on CP/M, MS-DOS and PC-DOS. PC-DOS was the version built for IBM computers, which were the first general purpose computers, such as PCs. But MS-DOS was then sold separately by Microsoft. And eventually, Microsoft also developed visual, versions which used the mouse. And again, a lot of that research and work was originally paid for and developed in combination with IBM. So IBM came back and said, right, can you create an actual operating system that uses this new mouse? And they created OS2, Operating System 2. However, Microsoft, being Microsoft at the time, developed their own version of it, which they simply called Windows. And we came out with a very early version of Windows back in the 1990s, but very quickly Windows 3 was the first particularly important operating system of the Windows environment of note. And since Windows 3, it's developed very quickly. At some points, every year or two, there was a new variant, sometimes named after the year, sometimes named after the actual model number. So we are now in the process of Windows 11, but as you can see, we've taken a few variants to get there. And the Windows 10 you see there is basically the predecessor of Windows 11. And just in case you're wondering, yes, Windows 12 will be with us soon. So we will have Windows 12, and there's already plans for Windows 13 and 14 on the board. Believe it or not, it's not actually the most common operating system in the world. The operating system we use most is the operating system we don't know we're using. For example, when you're going on the internet, the vast majority of the operating systems you use when you're on websites are Unix based, and particularly Linux. Okay? But there's one other key operating system which you may or may not have heard of, and that is from Apple. And Apple, again, developed their technology from others. In this case, they're going quite a way back to the 1980s. And in 1983, we actually can see Apple using technology they got under license from Xerox PARC. Xerox in the form of the manufacturers of photocopiers, yes, indeed. So Xerox sold some basic underlying technologies, and Xerox were the first to develop the mouse. They gave it the name, they gave it the inspiration of having multiple buttons, or at least a button on, and it was Apple who used that technology in its very first graphical operating system, even before Microsoft. Okay, so when Microsoft was still using text-based, Apple were creating an operating system called Apple Lisa, which was extremely expensive, but at the time was very good sort of benchmark to show people what could be done. That quickly became the Mac OS, and that Mac OS over a number of years was developed into another offshoot of the Apple operating system called the Mac OS X, or as we call it now, OS X. Okay, or Mac OS. So there's a whole variety over time of these different operating systems. Interestingly, in about the early 20s, Mac also branched to using a variant of Linux. So Darwin OS, which was basically an offshoot of Berkeley's own variant of Unix. So there's Unix, there's Berkeley. Berkeley had a number of variants, including a variant called Darwin, which was developed separately. And Darwin OS was actually used in the early 20s to port over their classic Mac operating system into what they realized was a more durable and long-lasting core technology, which was Unix. And that's why when we look at the world of operating systems, you actually have a huge family tree with very much of it coming all the way back to the good old Unix, and even that was predated by Multics. And all these variants of operating systems over years and years have developed into the three main operating systems we know now, which is Windows, Mac OS all sorts of variants for phones and such like, and of course Android for mobile devices. And that is very shortly and simply the history of operating systems.